Snow in the city is honest and dangerous at once. Honest because it shows everything it covers, and dangerous because it shows everything it can't hide. That Christmas Eve, the lights looked too bright, like someone trying to charm the cold into leaving. People walked under the trees and pretended their breath was only steam, that the hands they held could keep out entire winters. In that glow, Daniel Reyes and his little daughter Lily moved like a private constellation, father and child following the sparkle, small and defiant in a city that loved spectacle. Daniel's coat was thrift store navy, his shoes scruffy for a successful restaurant tour, because whatever else the man was, second generation, single parent, sometimes brittle with sorrow, he had been a vegan for a decade and a believer in simple goodness, lentil stews, careful gestures, words that softened edges. His wife's photograph sat in the corner of his apartment like a question he had to answer each morning. How do we live when someone we love dies and leaves a small person in need of a story to tell? Lily tugged his sleeve toward the Rockefeller tree where 1,000 people practiced the holiday ritual of being moved. Daniel smiled, chest hollow with a grief that had learned to be polite, and followed. They had almost reached the carolers when Lily stopped, hand brave and small, and pointed. Daniel looked where she did and found a bench at the bus stop. A woman slept there like a story someone had forgotten to finish. A baby lay tiny against her chest, wrapped in a blanket so thin it might as well have been prayer. "Daddy," Lily said, voice low with the single truth children carry, "her baby is freezing." And the world, the city that had been humming with playlists and consumption, did something that felt against the current. It looked away. Daniel did not. He bent, unwrapped the red scarf from Lily's neck with hands that had become used to giving rather than taking, and covered the infant. He said what some people whisper to themselves when they choose to be brave: "You can't stay here tonight." That voice belongs to someone whose ethics start in the body, not the boardroom. He offered warmth and a ride, and for one breath, the city stopped being a rumor. Mara's name when she woke was Mara Cruz. The baby's name was Jonah. The bench had been their world for weeks. Daniel's offer would change the edges of that world. Not because he was wealthy, he wasn't in the way tabloids would count, but because he had an appointment with compassion and he kept it. That night was small, and that night would grow. There is a kind of shame that arrives on two tracks: the private shame of not having enough and the public shame of being unknown enough to be judged. Mara stepped into the back of Daniel's SUV with her child wrapped in a borrowed warmth, and she carried both shames like a thief carries a secret. Inside his car, Lily offered Jonah a stuffed rabbit, as if she understood the arithmetic of healing. One small gift, plus a safe lap, equals a story where someone else is saved. Mara's eyes darted from that toy to Lily's face and found, unaccountably, a mirror. She'd been a student once, a painter with a portfolio and a stubborn faith in color. Then life contracted, a pregnancy countered by abandonment, family doors closing because shame is a form of firewall in some families. At the Orchard, Daniel's small farm-to-table cafe, he made a suite available for the night, a room kept for vendors, not meant to house strangers, but the city's rules bend when a baby's lips go blue. He asked only two things: that Mara accept a hot shower and that they let him help. She said yes, because sometimes yes is the only survival. In the quiet hours, with the city muffled by snow, Daniel sat on the edge of a couch in an old town suite and watched Mara bathe Jonah like someone putting pieces back into a fragile puzzle. He had a promise he had whispered once at a hospital bedside, a promise he had not entirely fulfilled: to teach Lily how to be kind. He understood, in a way the world writes in press releases as character development, that kindness is not a single generous check. It is an apprenticeship. He did not expect headlines. He only expected to do what he thought his wife would have done. Yet the city is a rumor machine. A passerby snapped a photo. The photo became a question that would be asked by thousands. Why did a vegan dad bring a homeless mother into a hotel suite? The answer would ask bigger things back. What is responsibility when someone has resources? What is courage when you choose to not be afraid of one person's need? Mara slept with Jonah warmed, and for a few hours, a woman who had been invisible felt lightness return. But by morning, the world would begin to lean in, and in leaning, it would unsettle the fragile truce they had purchased with a scarf and a ride.
The photograph was nothing to the camera that took it. A child handing a rabbit to a baby. Snowflakes blurred. But photographs are hungry things. They tell the world what it wants to think about itself. Overnight, the image of Daniel and Lily became not an act, but a label. Savior, scandal, saint. People chose the story they wanted.
Just look at this.
On one side were the feeds that celebrated generosity. Influencers called Daniel the vegan hero. His cafe did not know whether to prepare for praise or for protesters. On the other side, a gossip column queried motives. What business did a small restaurateur have playing benefactor? Was there a PR angle? A chatter started among Daniel's neighbors and the investors who sometimes glanced at his accounts. Kindness is romantic until it becomes risky. Mara felt the wind of attention like winter wind. It chilled her in even smaller ways. She'd never asked to be famous. Fame is a fabric that does not fit over ruin comfortably. She worried, as many do when the world looks, that her history might be used, that the same cameras that can show a rescue can also cut it into a spectacle. Daniel watched the headlines with a peculiar mix, pride for the connection his daughter had made, and a deep unease. He knew the city's appetite for moralizing. He had built a small life around values, not image. Now the values had currency in ways he did not choose. He resolved to protect Mara's privacy, even as he was compelled to speak. He did not call a press conference. He called his sister, a lawyer whose days had trained her to translate compassion into policy language. He asked quietly, "How do you do good without being owned by the story of the good deed?" That, the sister said, is the work of boundaries. Help with dignity.
Hi, everyone.
Offer help that respects the person who receives it. The day was not yet over. Markets and feeds change overnight. But the decision Daniel made then to create a temporary plan of support rather than allow a publicity machine to turn a woman into a narrative would be the hinge on which everything else swung. Because in this city, if you take a hand, you often also accept the world's willingness to look inside. Daniel offered Mara and Jonah a place on his small property upstate, an old caretaker's cottage. Insulation? Practical. Not a palace, not a cage. He offered medical appointments, help finding childcare support, and a small stipend so she could breathe and begin. Mara accepted with a caveat. She would work, not be a recipient. Pride had learned how to survive. Now it needed a job. She wanted to paint again. She wanted to teach her son colors before they taught him caution. Daniel found a way, a community arts fellowship through a nonprofit he'd supported. He signed the paperwork quietly. The city did not need to see this ledger. The terms were practical: rent covered for 3 months, a pathway to a portfolio, and a referral to a local shelter network that provided free childcare while she went to classes. But life does not give second acts gently. Within a week, Victor Landon, a rival restaurateur, and the sort of man who believed in headlines as currency, smelled a story he could weaponize. He sent a tip to a magazine that ran stories about the wealthy behaving well so he could frame Daniel as someone buying virtue. The magazine sent a photographer. The photographer found Lily giving Jonah a toy and called it the millionaire's mystery. Rumors spread that Daniel wanted to adopt, that his gesture had strings. Mara was furious at the idea. She had been stripped of control for months. She would not be stripped of narrative now. Daniel, for his part, realized that generosity in a networked world arrives with interest detached from strangers. He had to be careful not to let kindness be a pawn. He chose transparency. An open letter on the cafe's blog, short, human, that explained what had happened. He named no sums, he named no expectations. He wrote about his promise to his late wife and about Lily's insistence on not walking away from a child who was cold. He reached for honesty, because honesty is the only currency that holds steady when headlines collapse. The article went out. Some praised him, others accused him, but the work he had set in motion, Mara's fellowship, Jonah's warm crib, and Lily's steady curiosity continued. The cottage held them like a breath. The cottage quiet was a new kind of wealth. It was not enough to fix everything, but it was enough to begin.
Mara had a sketchbook that was more paper than history. In the margins, she drew faces she'd seen sleeping on subway seats and hands that reached out to offer $1. She had a small, scarred memory of ambition, a scholarship, a midterm she could not pay for, a boyfriend who left when she told him there would be a child. Her mother's door closed. That was the arithmetic that added to her being on a bench. When her past arrived, it came dressed as a social editor with a camera, asking for access, then a name: Vanessa Hart. Vanessa's story angle was cruelly simple: a homeless woman falling into the orbit of a kind man. It would be a headline built of pity and spectacle. Mara refused. She would not be a prop. But another knock came in the form of a phone call from a shelter caseworker. A landlord in Mara's neighborhood, after news of her temporary housing, had posted eviction notices to the building where her mother lived. The ripple effects of a single photograph were already moving like water through a maze. Daniel saw the pattern. Kindness that is public can pull at the threads of private lives in ways no one intends. So he acted again, quietly. He called in favors, a call to the nonprofit director, to the inspector who could mediate a landlord's illegal eviction, to a pediatric nurse who could provide follow-up for Jonah. He refused press interviews. He asked his staff to speak only of soup recipes on camera. He attempted to cordon off this human story from the machinery of celebrity. Mara learned to breathe differently. In the cottage, she sketched a boy with Jonah's tiny fingers and Lily's wide, curious eyes. She began taking classes at the local community college, an evening course on illustration that let her fingers relearn long-lost muscle memory. It was slow work: painting, feeding Jonah, napping in a safety she'd not had for months. The city felt like a rumor from which she had been temporarily absolved. The world had not forgiven her yet. It had not even finished judging. But for the first time since the bench, she could think in sentences longer than survival. The healing was messy, not romantic, but honest. And in the honesty, a new plot began to form. A story where generosity and dignity might coexist without collapsing into spectacle or shame. No good story about public charity avoids a test. Victor Landon's interest escalated. He was less a human than a machine set to measure reputation against revenue. To him, Daniel's generosity was a liability to be exploited. He engineered a smear, an op-ed that claimed Daniel had used Mara's story to push a new line of branded compassion, a marketing ploy. The piece insinuated that the cottage was a PR stage and that Mara's art was part of a curated narrative. The newsroom loved narrative conflict. The op-ed ran with images taken outside the cottage, taken without consent. Mara woke to a different kind of cold: accusation. Strangers wrote about her as if she were a weather report. She wanted to scream, to explain that being homeless is not a plot device. It is a life that needs work and empathy, not headlines. Daniel felt the sting of betrayal as the board of one investor raised eyebrows. He had built a brand on seasonal suppers and honest produce. Now people who kept ledgers wanted to know whether he had equity in virtue. He called a press meeting because he had to, not because he believed in press, but because in a networked world, silence is often misread as guilt. He told the truth again in simpler terms. He had paid for a week's lodging. He had set up an arts fellowship. He had helped with childcare. He did not import a PR agency. He refused to monetize Mara's story. He asked for discretion and for a chance to solve the problem quietly. Mara watched from the cottage doorway. She had an opinion. She was not a passive subject. When asked by a journalist whether she would press charges for the intrusion, she answered simply, "I want a job, not pity." The phrase spooled tighter than a ribbon. It moved in the feeds like a tiny rope pulling at someone's coat. For people who believe that stories must have villains, Victor was the villain. For people who believe charity should be private, Daniel had become an unwelcome nuisance. But what changed the tenor of the conversation was what Daniel did next. He invited other local restaurants, nonprofits, and community leaders to a forum at his cafe. Not a press event, but a working meeting. He wanted resources, not accolades. He wanted a system that did not let a woman be homeless with a baby in winter because of individual acts of mercy. The city had policies. The city had money. The city had apathy. He wanted to turn these into leverage for policy. It began as a single
to bring you
meeting
the
and
truth
grew into a
and
coalition.
dignity
People
in
who had
this
been
complex
comfortable watching in
situation.
clips now had to look at real data.
We need
Causes
to
of
provide more
homelessness,
than just
eviction rates,
shelter,
lack
but
of
true
childcare,
support.
drug policy
I
intersections.
completely agree.
For the
The
first
root
time,
causes are complex.
compassion was accompanied by mechanism. Mara kept sketching. Jonah grew weight on his chest. Lily practiced being brave.
Journalists love a tidy scandal, but they cannot ignore data when it speaks. A small group of reporters, not the gossip pages, but the kind that read municipal budgets before they write, dug into eviction records and shelter placement data. What they found was not a single villain, but a network of small systemic failures. Landlords pushing out tenants, shelters underfunded, childcare subsidies mired in paperwork. The photograph that had started as a single frame suddenly became a doorway into a city's blind spots. Daniel's coalition released an initial plan, a rapid response fund to prevent evictions, a registry of emergency cribs and strollers for babies, and a fellowship program that offered a pathway from shelter to portfolio. It was not revolutionary. It was not meant to be. It was precise, administrative, human. The first grant came from a local philanthropic trust that had long preferred anonymity. It arrived in a small envelope with a note. Use it where it does most good. Mara's art began to show again, healed and raw. She painted Jonah as a winter bird, as a wave, as a shape of possibility. The city that had once seen her as anonymous began to see faces in her sketches. Galleries that once rejected street artists for their lack of pedigree asked to display her work. Suddenly, Grace, the woman who had been sleeping on a bench, became an artist with exhibitions scheduled in community centers and small galleries. She resisted the spotlight, but she accepted the chance to be read as an author of her own life. Meanwhile, in a different part of town, Victor organized a campaign to discredit the entire initiative. He presented numbers showing that emergency funds sometimes failed to produce long-term stability. He had charts and calm men in suits who loved the economy of fear. The city council debated, papers argued, and the debate took on the feel of a morality play in which real people were footnotes. What shifted the argument was a taped interview a social worker gave, her voice steady. We see families turned out for minor complaints. A baby's health declines because a parent misses one medical appointment due to transportation issues. When you fix the small things, rides, temporary housing, childcare, the big things get easier to manage. It's not charity, it's fixing leaks. That, said simply, had power. Daniel's coalition proved that targeted, well-administered help could prevent long-term disaster. They helped Mara secure a part-time teaching job at the community center, where she taught illustration to teenagers who had their own stories of being overlooked. Jonah began a regular checkup schedule. Lily learned that kindness is stubborn and repeatable. The cracks in the system had been exposed. The city had begun to put plaster in the right places. Winter's long hours give people the chance to become softer or harder. This winter, people in Daniel's orbit chose softness. Mara's first exhibition at the community gallery sold small prints that paid for a week's groceries. Jonah learned to laugh loud enough that his mother forgot to count the cold. Daniel's Cafe hosted a pop-up for a warmth drive that collected coats and formula. The line of donors waiting to help wound down the block. But the human heart is not a ledger. The problem with doing the right thing in the public eye is that every kindness invites scrutiny, and scrutiny often expects a drama. So a drama arrived. Victor amplified a rumor that Daniel was seeking tax breaks for his kindness, that he had used a charity to launder goodwill into real estate credits. The rumor was false, but rumor is the city's favorite instrument. It plays fast and leaves scars. Daniel had learned to be blunt now. He returned to the cafe for a short statement where he read a single paragraph. Helping other people is neither a transaction nor a spectacle. It's a responsibility. If you disagree, come to me with solutions, not insults. He posted the text and left, and the post went viral for reasons he could not entirely control. The ensuing debate looked at him with a mixture of admiration and hunger. At night, When people slept and the city quieted like a crowd that had lost its voice, Daniel would sit in the kitchen and hold the photograph of his wife. He would tell Lily stories about the woman who taught him to be patient and stubborn with love. He would say, "We didn't rescue anyone alone. We made space for each other." He meant it. The coalition had created systems. The woman on the bench had taught a child to give his stuffed rabbit away. A man had learned to listen. The winter eased, and a small warmth remained. Jonah's cheeks recovered their pigment. Mara was sketching children she met at the community center, each line an act of recovery. Lily learned that kindness doesn't make headlines, people do. And sometimes, when you stop to warm a child with a scarf, you change the shape of a life.
It began with a blog post, and like most revolutions disguised as kindness, it spiraled into something no one could contain. A prominent talk show host mentioned Daniel Reyes on live television, calling him the vegan dad who fixed the system. The phrase sounded noble, almost cinematic, but every headline that simplifies a human being also builds a cage around him. By morning, Daniel's cafe was flooded with customers. Some came for food, others came for selfies, as if compassion were contagious through proximity. He smiled, but every flash from a phone felt like lightning striking something delicate inside him. His mission, to help one mother and child, was being swallowed by an industry of inspiration. And with inspiration came suspicion. Talk radio hosts debated his motives. Was he sincere or strategic? Had he discovered the algorithm of charity? A conservative columnist sneered, calling him a tofu messiah for the internet age. A progressive journalist wrote, "If one man can fix homelessness with soup and empathy, what excuse do the rest of us have?" The world wasn't sure whether to hug him or hang him. And through all of it, Mara kept her head down, painting at the community center while Jonah napped in the stroller beside her easel. For her, the media storm was just weather, noisy, temporary, and incapable of changing the fact that she still needed diapers, still needed work, still needed peace. Daniel wanted to protect her, but the irony of compassion is that once the world names it, compassion becomes a brand, and brands have shareholders, some invisible, some within ourselves. 2 weeks later, a black sedan parked outside the Orchard Cafe. From it stepped a woman whose presence blended warmth with authority. Deputy Mayor Evelyn Cortez. She'd read the reports, seen the photographs, and wanted to evaluate community impact. It sounded official, but Daniel sensed something personal in her tone. Over a table of roasted vegetable soup and sourdough, Evelyn asked what Daniel really wanted, not for the cameras, not for his conscience, but for the city. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't a politician, he was a father. But maybe that was the qualification the world had forgotten it needed. He said quietly, "I want no child to be cold enough that kindness has to go viral." That line would be quoted for months, but in that moment, it was just truth. Evelyn saw a chance to make policy out of empathy. She invited Daniel to join an advisory board, one that could test new emergency housing protocols and expand childcare access. Mara's story became Exhibit A of what compassion could look like when bureaucracy didn't choke it. That night, Daniel told Lily that the city wanted to make helping people into a rule. She frowned and said, "Why does it need to be a rule? Shouldn't it just be what people do?" He smiled, realizing she had voiced the very question philosophers wrestled with for centuries. What should be law, and what should simply be love? At the community gallery downtown, Mara's small art exhibit opened under soft lights. Her paintings, all watercolors, carried no titles, only dates. Each captured a moment of survival. A mother clutching a child against cold glass, a pair of hands sharing an apple, the curve of a scarf, floating like a promise. Critics called her a street-born visionary, though she winced at the phrase. For her, painting was not ambition reborn. It was therapy that spoke louder than words. She refused interviews and donated half her proceeds to the city's infant care initiative that had once helped her. The night of the opening, Daniel stood quietly at the back, watching people look at her art. He realized that true kindness is not what we give, it's what we allow others to become because of what we gave. In that moment, he saw something sacred, the possibility of lives rebuilt not by grand gestures, but by ordinary persistence. But peace never lasts untested. A media outlet, hungry for fresh angles, tracked down Mara's estranged mother in Queens. The woman, bitter and weary, accused Daniel of taking advantage of her daughter's weakness. It was cruel, inaccurate, but viral. And in a world where outrage trends faster than truth, the seeds of doubt were sown again.
Public compassion has a hidden tax: exposure. The more Daniel's work grew, the more people wanted a piece of it. Donors asked for branding rights, investors whispered about expansion. One executive even suggested franchising the Orchard as a national chain of ethical eateries. Daniel felt sick. He hadn't set out to monetize mercy. Every dollar of fame felt like counterfeit currency compared to the quiet honesty of that night on the bench. Lily noticed the change first. Her father's laughter had become rare, replaced by the tired sighs of a man trying to guard meaning from commerce. One evening she asked, "Daddy, did being good make you sad?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out at the city lights and said, "No, sweetheart, but sometimes when people start selling goodness, they forget what it felt like to give it for free." Meanwhile, Mara was grappling with her own choice. A national talk show offered her a paid interview. It would have solved months of financial worry, but she declined, writing in an email, "The story isn't mine to sell. It's ours to live." For a brief moment, that refusal became its own kind of rebellion. The storm returned, this time from the financial world. Victor Landon, still resentful, leaked confidential documents suggesting Daniel had mishandled charitable funds. The accusation was fabricated, but devastating. Bank accounts were frozen, suppliers withdrew contracts, and in less than a week, the cafe that had started it all teetered on the edge of collapse. Journalists who once praised him now questioned his transparency. Television hosts framed it as the fall of the vegan Samaritan. Daniel could have hired a crisis management firm, but he chose something more human: honesty. He called a community meeting at the cafe. No PR screens, no press badges, just neighbors. He laid every document on the counter: receipts, ledgers, letters. "Here's everything," he said. "If I did wrong, tell me where. But if you still believe in what we began, then don't let cynicism win." The silence that followed was heavy, trembling. Then a woman stood, one of the cafe's dishwashers, and said, "You fed us before you fed the cameras. That's enough for me." Applause grew, not loud, but steadfast. It was the sound of trust rediscovering its voice. The audit that followed cleared Daniel completely. But the experience changed him. He realized that public redemption isn't the same as peace, and that doing good for others must never depend on applause. Children often see truths adults complicate. One cold afternoon, as Daniel walked Lily home from school, she pointed at a new family sleeping under the bridge. She tugged his sleeve and whispered, "Daddy, it's happening again." Her words hit him like scripture. Compassion isn't a project, it's a rhythm. There would always be another person in need, another night too cold, another system too slow. And maybe that was the point, to never let the work end, to keep the heart restless in the service of others. They brought blankets, soup, and Lily's old mittens. But more than charity, they brought conversation. Names were exchanged, stories shared, laughter found. Lily learned that kindness begins when fear ends. That evening, she drew a picture: 3 stick figures under a bridge, one small heart glowing red between them.
She taped it to the cafe's wall. Underneath, she wrote in wobbly letters, "We are all somebody's warmth." People who came to eat noticed it, and without speeches or campaigns, donations quietly increased again. Sometimes hope doesn't shout, it whispers through a child's handwriting. Months later, Mara's mother appeared at the cafe's door. She looked older, smaller, as if regret itself had weight. Daniel watched from the counter as Mara froze, torn between anger and instinct. Silence built like fog between them. Finally, the older woman spoke. "I saw your paintings. You made the baby's eyes look like the sun I used to pray under. I came to say I was wrong." Mara's hands shook. Forgiveness is the hardest art. Harder than portrait, harder than penance. But Jonah laughed in her arms, and that sound softened the air. She said quietly, "Then let's both try again." They sat together for hours. No cameras, no headlines. Only soup, stories, and the soft stitching of two lives rejoining at the seams. Outside, snow began to fall again, like the first night Daniel had seen them on the bench. This time, no one was cold. This time, the city had learned to notice.
By spring, the Orchard Coalition had become a citywide model. Over 50 cafes and community centers joined the cause, sharing food surpluses with shelters, converting unused rooms into emergency lodging. They called it Project Hearth. Mara designed the logo, a small flame inside an open hand. Documentary crews came from Los Angeles and Berlin. The mayor's office allocated permanent funding. But Daniel's greatest pride was watching Lily volunteer at the distribution table, her laughter echoing through the same streets that once ignored the homeless. When a journalist asked him if he felt like a hero, he shook his head. "I just listened to a 6-year-old who told me a baby was freezing," he said. Everything after that was the world remembering what she already knew. Project Hearth grew beyond him, as all genuine acts of love should. And though his name faded from headlines, his influence remained in the warmth spreading quietly from hand to hand. A vegan father, a once homeless artist, and a child whose compassion became the city's conscience. Fame fades like perfume, slowly, invisibly, until only the memory of its scent remains. By the next winter, the headlines were gone. The Orchard Cafe had returned to what it was always meant to be, a small, warm place where people came to eat and remember they were not alone. Daniel still cooked most nights, lentil stew, roasted carrots, bread baked with care. But there was a peace in his movement now, a rhythm earned, not hurried. Mara painted in a sunlit studio near the river, teaching art therapy to women rebuilding their lives after homelessness. Her work had matured, less about suffering, more about transformation. Each brushstroke was both a wound remembered and a scar healed. And Lily had grown taller. She no longer whispered her questions, she declared them. One evening she asked, "Daddy, why do people only help when it's winter?" Daniel smiled, stirring the pot. "Because that's when we see each other's breath," he said. "Maybe the cold just makes us remember we all breathe the same air." The cafe windows fogged with warmth. Outside, the world moved faster, new crises, new headlines. But in that little corner, kindness was not a trend, it was a tradition. One morning, an envelope arrived. No return address, just neat handwriting. To Daniel Reyes. Inside was a letter from a man named Richard Calloway, a venture capitalist Daniel had never met. Richard wrote, "I was one of those who doubted you. I said you were naive, but last month my son was injured, and a family from your project brought us meals for weeks. I never knew what it felt like to be on the receiving end of help without price tags. I was wrong about you." He ended with a question. What would it take to build Project Hearth nationwide? Daniel stared at the page for a long time. Part of him wanted to protect what they had, the local, intimate, human texture of it all. Another part heard his late wife's voice in memory. When something good burns steady,
Don't hide the flame, share it. So he called Mara. Together they drafted a plan, not for profit, not for recognition, but for replication. They would teach other cities how to weave compassion into infrastructure, quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. The new chapter began not with a headline, but with a handwritten apology that turned into possibility. Months later, a modest auditorium in Boston filled with social workers, small business owners, and city officials. Daniel stood on stage, awkward in a suit, holding no slides, just stories. He spoke about Lily's scarf, about Mara's courage, about the night compassion interrupted convenience. Mara followed with her own talk, showing her paintings as living archives of survival. No statistics, no slogans, just the human face of policy. The audience didn't applaud right away. They sat in silence, the kind that means people are listening with their hearts, not their hands. Then someone rose, a mayor from Detroit, and said, "We want to do this in our city." Then another, and another. Within a year, 12 cities had adopted the Hearth model. Within 3 years, it became a federal pilot program. What had begun as a scarf on a freezing night became policy written in compassion's language. But Daniel never bragged. He kept telling people, "It wasn't my idea, it was my daughter's." Time has a way of balancing light and shadow. One summer, Daniel's sister, the lawyer who had helped him navigate those early storms, passed away suddenly from a stroke. Her death hit him like an echo of all the losses he had already endured. At the funeral, Mara stood beside him. Lily, now 12, held his hand with a tenderness beyond her years. When they returned home, Daniel sat at the kitchen table long after dark. Mara joined him and whispered, "You always help others carry their grief. Let someone carry yours." He looked at her, eyes wet. "How do you keep giving when everything keeps taking?" Mara answered, "Because that's what saved us. If we stop, then the cold wins again." Her words stayed with him. For the first time, Daniel understood that compassion is not about rescuing others. It's about staying human in a world that keeps trying to make you forget how.
5 years later, Project Hearth held its first national reunion. People who had once been homeless arrived by train and bus, dressed in the quiet dignity of rebuilt lives. Mothers carried children, now grown. Social workers came bearing notebooks filled with stories of small miracles. When Daniel took the microphone, he said something unexpected. "I'm not here to celebrate what we built. I'm here to apologize for the times we didn't see soon enough, act fast enough, love deeply enough. But I believe this: we are no longer a nation of strangers. We are a family, rediscovering warmth." Applause thundered, not the polite kind, but the kind that feels like rain after drought. Afterward, a man approached, middle-aged, strong, once homeless. He said, "You don't know me, but you helped me years ago. That blanket your daughter gave, I kept it. I used it till I didn't need it anymore. Then I gave it to someone else." He smiled. "That scarf has been around the country now. Maybe one day it'll come back to her." Daniel laughed softly, eyes glistening. Maybe that's how kindness travels, one thread at a time. Years folded gently into one another. Lily became a young woman, studying social policy at university, interning with the very program she'd unknowingly inspired. Mara's paintings hung in public libraries and hospitals, where their color soothed more than words could. Daniel, silver now at the temples, walked slower but smiled easier. He'd begun hosting quiet dinners for young activists and artists, teaching them not only how to cook, but how to care. He'd say, "Recipes are stories too. Every flavor remembers someone who was hungry once." The city around them had changed. Fewer tents under bridges, more community kitchens,
More partnerships between small businesses and shelters. No miracle, just momentum. One crisp autumn evening as he closed the
How was
cafe
your day,
for the
my dear?
last time before retirement,
It was great, Dad.
Daniel turned off the lights and whispered, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he was thanking God, fate, or the memory of a little girl's voice saying, "Daddy, her baby is freezing." Maybe all three. A decade later, long after Daniel had retired, Lily, now a policy advisor in Washington, received a package in the mail. Inside was an old red scarf, worn thin but clean, and a note that read, "This scarf kept me alive in Denver, warmed my daughter in Kansas, and reached me again in Portland. Someone said it started in New York. Maybe it belongs home." She held it, eyes wet. She called her father, now living quietly on the coast. "Dad," she said softly, "it came back." He didn't ask what she meant. He knew. Because kindness, like the sea, always finds its way home. They framed the scarf and hung it in a small community shelter with a plaque. Kindness is not lost. It just keeps moving. When Daniel passed away, he did so peacefully, at home, surrounded by people whose lives had touched his. The city held a vigil outside the cafe. Candles lined the street, flickering like tiny constellations remembering their star. Mara spoke softly to the crowd. "He taught us that compassion is not charity, it's clarity. It's seeing the world as it should be, not as it is." Lily, standing beside her, whispered to the cameras, "He taught me that love isn't loud. It's persistent." And somewhere in the distance, snow began to fall again, slow, soundless, merciful. People offered their scarves to strangers as they walked home. It was instinct now, not imitation. The city had learned. Years
taught me
later,
love
a
isn't
documentary
loud
about
play,
Project
it's
Hearth would play
persistent.
on public television. The narrator would end with these words, "Once a man and his daughter stopped because a baby was cold. They didn't know the cameras were watching. They didn't know it would change anything. But in choosing warmth over hurry, they rewrote the city's moral code." In classrooms, teachers would show the footage. In churches and synagogues, people would quote his words, "Help without spectacle." And in homes across the country, parents would remind their children that sometimes one scarf, one bowl of soup, one small act can turn a frozen night into the first dawn of a better world.
Let's go help!
The story would
We're
end
making a
there,
real difference here
but
today.
the work would not. Because compassion, once awakened, does not sleep again. And maybe that is all heaven ever wanted from us.
Love is an
To keep
eternal
the
flame,
fire lit,
a thread
to
that
keep the
weaves through
baby
time.
warm, to keep believing that love, when given freely, never dies.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and leave a kind comment. To help the channel stay motivated to create more great videos, please hit the subscribe button. Wishing you happiness and peace in the light and love of God.